we will now go on to some reflections by Sanna and Gilbert. And both, it looks very simple on paper if you look at Stanislav's process, but the devil is really in the detail. And so I've asked Sanna and Gilbert to reflect a bit on making the process come true. It's really about the nuances and how you do it. And based on your very, very extensive experiences, what are the key nuances which make the difference between success and failure? So, Sanna, let me start with you. When we can stop sharing, then we can give the full screen to Sanna.
Hello. I think the my key learning on this one is that I think there's a couple of things to think about. I think one of the key things I found best is when possible, or the ways possible, is to actually involve the whole leadership team, not just the CEO, but the broader leadership team. Now, of course, if the CEO has resigned, this is a rather easy task. It's a more difficult task if the CEO is somebody that you have to remove from the position. And for me, that is still doable, because as any chair, you should have a connection to all of these people on the management team. Because as Stanislav put it very well, it is this psychological trick of understanding what the team needs, what the company needs as a person, same time as understanding what the company will be needing in the next 5 years. And that combination of trying to make sure ahead of time, proactively, that you have an enough in-depth knowledge on the layers before or under the CEO, so when needed, you can engage them. That was, for me, being one of the best ways of actually trying to help and ensure that the process go right. I think another point that I would say is, I think as a board, understanding that the failure is a possibility is also a very good thing to keep in mind, because you think you're going to be after the perfect candidate and you're going to do everything to choose the right candidate. But if you then ask yourself what can be going wrong, and I'll give you an example. Whenever I do the final references of the people that we have ended up choosing, I actually call these people myself, and I don't ask them what's good and bad about this person. I ask, because we all have some areas we are not very strong. So what do we have, or what does this candidate or this person have, that if I would be, the new boss, what would I support him with so he doesn't fail on those areas that are more likely to be his failures? I think that's a key thing, because nobody is perfect. And if you from the start understand the strength of the CEO or incoming CEO and the kind of, how would I say, weaknesses of that CEO or less strong areas, that will help you to go on. And the final point I would say, that what I have found out is, I usually call a restart with the new CEOs after a year. So after a year, the CEOs start to say, I know it all, I've been here, done that, whatever. And then now we from the start have planned a restart tour. So for example, if they have gone across the organization, meeting certain places in the startup phase, we do a mini format of that one about a year later, in order to force them again go back to the organization as they will be a new CEOs, to again see the things with the eyes that they know something else or more. So those would be my 3 things on that one. I've been into, I don't know how many CEO things, and what I really find out is that planning the process and being prepared for it is more than 80% of the job. And then the execution is really depending on when the person starts. The process of choosing CEOs in the end, I wouldn't say it's easy, it's standard, but really then ensuring that you are prepared and then that you follow the CEO for the first year rather closely, specifically as a chair, but also as a board. That I would be my comments on this one.
Thank you, Sanna. I think this is some really good food for thought. Gilbert, what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, thank you very much, Annet, for engaging me on this one. And, credit to Stanislav of having put this book together and, interviewed and involved all of these key stakeholders. And the findings are extremely insightful. having been through this process myself, as a CEO, being recruited as an external CEO into a family-owned company, and having had this experience of working for private and public companies, and now chairing two companies where I manage this process, I think, my insights are the following. So first, strip out the emotions out of this process and, make it an ongoing process, because it is part of our fiduciary duty as a board, to make sure that we always have, a refreshed process about CEO succession and involve the CEO in early days. And that's where, I like, the recommendation of Stanislav also, and involving the CEO. And what I share with the CEOs in the companies I chair, and even in the companies where I don't chair, as a board director, is, we are not here talking about the under the bus scenario, but we're talking about two possibilities. One of them is the CEO winning the lottery, and that would be good news, and they might not be interested to work. Another opportunity could be of the incumbent CEO getting a second round CEO or a third round CEO in a bigger organization and receiving these offers that they cannot turn down. And obviously they need to look after their career and follow their own aspirations. So that's why, having an ongoing process, constantly refreshed, is part of our social and moral responsibility, part of our fiduciary duty, and at the same time, be ready, for these eventualities. So that's the first one. The second one is, the clarity, and the third one is the accountability. So making sure that who is accountable at every stage of the process, when the board is accountable and when CEO is accountable, and then the clarity of when you bring in a new CEO around, statement of authorities and expectations, from the board. And all of this will start, from the future, where we want the company to be in the next 5 years, and, bring it back to today's reality and making sure that we have the proper mapping on finding the right candidates. And here you look at three areas. The first one is on the board, in case we need an interim CEO, or do we need a CEO in an urgent situation? Do we have someone around the board table that could step into this interim position, or, potentially, being the CEO? The second bucket is internally within the organization. Do we have members on the executive committee whom are itching to become CEO and who have the capabilities to fill in these roles? And the third one, bench, is obviously external, and that's how you will have a proper mapping, refreshed at least twice a year.
Thank you, Gilbert. So let me open up now for the Q&A. I think we got a lot of food for thought, and we also got already quite a few questions from people when they signed up from the webinar and in the Q&A box. So the first...
Annet, could I make a short remark before we go into
Please
Q&A?
go.
I would like to thank Sana and Gilbert for their insights, and I have to blame myself because I speak to them often, and somehow I miss these two very good practices: the restart practice and the lottery practice. I guess I need to do the second edition of the book very, very quickly to reflect this. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And the nice thing about the things, it's really very positive. It's not so much, and so in that sense, the likelihood that people are really willing to work with that, I think it's a great way of framing, and as you said, psychologically very, very important. So great observations. So the first topic I would like to talk about. So I got a couple of questions. It's very easy to say CEO succession should be a permanent process, and we should always have some candidates in the pipeline. However, in practice, it's much more complicated. A CEO might perceive it to be very threatening, and then also there are very different players, and depending on the ownership of the company. Some of the shareholders might not be open for a new CEO or CEO succession, I also got a couple of questions from people saying, well, we really think we should have a new CEO, but our chair, he's so wedded to the CEO. How can we, start this discussion and start the whole process? So my question to you, Gilbert, you probably have seen this situation. So keeping this on the agenda and actually breaching this topic from, now it's really time not to only have a theoretical pipeline, but to really start going into action and managing all those stakeholders. How do you do that?
Yeah, Annette, it's a very good question. I think, as chairs, you on a regular basis, meet your key shareholders in the companies, and the two companies that I chair, being publicly listed companies on a Swiss SIX stock exchange. I do my governance roadshow, at least once a year, and I meet, the key shareholders. And in these discussions, you could have impressions about how are they satisfied, with the leadership of the CEO, how do they feel about the performance of the company, et cetera, et cetera. So you're getting some touch points from external stakeholders on their impressions. If you are on the right track, they strongly believe in your strategy, and it will be reflected in your share price performance and the future potential. So you will have these external sound bites that will be important for you, to calibrate your narrative. And at the same time, it's a process that you owe to your shareholders and stakeholders. And at the same time, what are the impressions of the board? Because the board, will have even more pulse and more sense than external stakeholders, because, the board interacts, with the CEO and management on a regular basis. What are the sound bites that they are getting when they have the skip level meetings with the hypos in the organization? What are the impressions that they have when executive management, come and present? When they ask questions, do they feel that the CEO is open or closed on engaging with the board? So is the CEO, leveraging the capacity and the knowledge that exists around the board table? So all of these indicators, will help the board, form their own impressions. At the same time, with the whole process, I think 100% is impossible. So I think when you look at the succession, you need to look at 80% ready CEOs, because 100% is not possible, and you will never get it right. You will keep fine-tuning it to the last element, and then, you will have an issue. So there is an element of risk, and this is where, the board and the chair, needs to hold hands and to say, look, this is the future candidate that, we will want to go after. And again, it's stripping out the emotions, because yes, chairs, might have favorites. And like Stanislav has said, follow the process to the end, and benchmark, engage key stakeholders, give the opportunity to every board director around the table to express their views if they feel comfortable, and making sure that, you keep the conversation flowing until you have real unanimity and board alignment behind the selected candidate.
And any tips, Gilbert, on if the chair is kind of, you're a chair yourself, but you're also, companies where someone else is the chair. So if the board or some members of the board really feel, the chair has to become more proactive, any tips on how you can bring up that conversation?
Proactive from which front, Annette?
So, for example, the chair is very happy with the CEO, doesn't want to change anything, and the board actually feels different.
Look, dialogue is always important, and especially in the Swiss culture, dialogue is important, and alignment is important. And if the chair is comfortable with the CEO, he needs to be able to articulate it properly to the board. Why is he comfortable? Is he or she comfortable because this is what they feel, or because of this is the feedback that they got from the shareholders, when they did their governance roadshow, when they did their interaction with, proxy advisors, with external stakeholders. So I think this is what the chair will need to articulate. And at the same time, if a specific board director has a different view, this director should be able to openly express their views. And the chair's capacity is to be able to read the room. Even if people don't express themselves, they need to be able to read the body language and to say, look, Annette, you seems uncomfortable with this position. What is your view? Can you tell us more about it? And that's the dialogue that they need to be engaged in. And again, here, we're all looking at the interest of the organization, because it's not about people. It is about the company. It is about the strategy. It is about, making sure that, we create value for all our stakeholders, and it is not personal. So the decision about a CEO change is not personal. It is about the interest of the corporation. So just to give you a perspective, today, for example, at SGS, we have 100,000 colleagues working for the company. So 100,000 salaries to pay on the 27th of every month. At Sandoz, 23,000 colleagues, 23,000 salaries to pay at the end of every month. So this is what you need to keep in perspective, the interest of the corporation and the company, and not, to make sure that individuals feel comfortably in a specific position or in a specific process.
Yeah, thank you.
May I
So it's
just
a big
make
picture.
a short comment on that, on this one, because I think it's a very good example when the process really helps, because it should not be dependent on a specific individual, even if this individual is a chair. And if you have a process, then you have a moment in time and space for that to express your concerns about the CEO.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good one.
Can I just very short? Yeah. Can I just say very, very short? Because I had an experience from this in past, so extremely short one. When there isn't always a process, what do you do then? Every good chair has a CV draft on their table somewhere. If something happens, gets over by train. If you, as a board member, say, do we have this document? If the CEO gets driven over by a train, do we have this document? And if you have this document, can we just have a look at it in one or the other, in the process method? And that sometimes in the past, that didn't happen. We wrote the thing and we realized that the current CEO didn't have 80% of the things we were wishing. So, then the kind of process got started by having this discussion of this theoretical brief of the new CEO. Then you got to the process because the process was halted. So that's just an experience from past. So that's it. Sorry.
Yeah, no, and I think the point is process sounds very boring, but at the end of the day, it's really it's the backbone of the CEO succession, because it takes it out of the person.
True.
So maybe let me
Annette,
go to
can I just make one more point?
Very
also,
short,
that is important. I'll make it short.
Yeah.
Look, every CEO, they have their objectives. What I usually do, the CEO has their objectives last week of November or first week of December from the board, so they can cascade it down the organization. And they have 2 reviews every year, first half, after the first half, and after the full year. And this review is done with the full board. So the board should be very clear about where does the CEO stand against delivering against the short-term and long-term objectives. And then there would be no confusion around where the CEO stands in terms of performance and expectations.
Yeah, no, and too often this is not done, even in large listed companies. You're very right. Sanna, I want to get to you to the next phase, namely, so you are in the CEO selection process, and I'm now not only talking about listed companies, but also family companies. And there were some remarks about companies in emerging economies where you have one major shareholder, very few independent directors. And so there might be very different views. So the CEO might have his or her favorite candidates. The family might have some very strong views on who it has to be. And you as a board are not completely aligned with those views. What is, in your experience, the best way to handle this and to ensure that, as Gilbert said, the candidate who's really the best for the company? So how do you handle this?
I think the first thing is to start with the things which are very neutral. And I hereby go back to Stanislav, which is agree on the process. Agree what the process steps are. Because if you're in agreement on the process steps, you already kind of have win some common battles, and that isn't easier to agree. The second thing is to agree on the brief. And the issue with the brief is very often in those kind of situations, it comes like the animal made by the committee, which is a mix of a banana, banana eating an ape and an elephant and a lion. And you need to ensure what are the very few, very, very few, and I say 3, 4 absolutely must be's. And if you can agree on those must be's and you have to force those must be's, then rest of it comes nice to have. Because everybody wants to see their part on there very often. But if you can agree that what is must do and what's nice to have, then you might have all the things in there that everybody in the different worlds wishes on there, but you have got an agreement what is the position. And I do this both for the knowledge, what is the competencies we are measuring, and also from the personalities. And for the families, the personalities tend to actually match much more than the competencies. So if you can again take this very process where you have the grade of the competencies, you have the personalities, must-haves, nice-haves. I have never seen a process that if you take it so simplistically, you have the process agreed, you do the brief, you agree the main points, then you can get going. Because then everybody gets to chip in their parts, but you still have to agree what it is. So that is for me the key. And yes, there's been struggles in the processes, but I have never seen a process that has completely stopped if you actually agree on these parts.
Yeah, I think it's very true, and that's also search firms like to come up with a very, very long list. So any candidate ticks a few of the boxes. And I think, Stanislav, in your book, you also talk a bit about pivots. Maybe I think that's a very important point. Maybe you can say 2 words around that.
I think the pivot is a very, very useful tool when it comes down to making a final decision about the CEO selection. And this is the point, I mentioned it earlier, where often boards forget about everything they've done and sort of go on the gut feeling basis, because the CEO profile is good, but the final 2 or 3 candidates, they all kind of match the expectation of the profile. And how do you make decision? And then people go, okay, well, she's a good girl and he is not such a great guy, so let's choose her. And the pivot gives you an opportunity to step back a little bit and ask yourself the question, okay, so what is the strategic intent of our company? As Gilbert said earlier, where do we want to be in 5 years? And what are the 2 or 3 key things which we really want to see in our leader to be able to get us there? And then you agree on that and you apply it, you apply it to your candidates. And most of the time it becomes very, very clear who should be your next CEO. In my experience, I remember quite a few situations when we really were stuck and we felt like we don't know which way to go. But after doing this pivot exercise, it became very clear who should be our next CEO.
Yeah. So Stanislav, as I'm with you anyway, so I had a couple of questions around the future. So even if you go out and speak to shareholders and analysts, very often the profile is quite focused on the current needs, but there might be some very different future needs. And one question specifically was around, for example, AI. I know you did a lot of research on boards and AI. With the advent of AI, would you need very different profiles? Or at the end of the day, is it the same type of profile, but you just need to put more emphasis on attributes like collaboration, innovation ability, learning from errors? So if you look, and also if you more and more look at CEOs, maybe from different industries, so how do you deal the best with the future, and will there be any impact of AI? And someone also asked, like you will have AI board members, might you have an AI CEO companion or something like that? What can you reflect a bit on the future?
Thank you. Two comments, and it would be great if Sanna and Gilbert could share their views on this. I think the first one is that AI can have, it's not exactly answering your question, but I would like to say this. I think AI really helps boards to run different scenarios, and including scenarios for the CEO profile. If our business goes this way, what kind of CEO do we need, and what kind of CEO will be successful? So it makes it easy. It makes it easier to work on the profiles. On your question, what are the changes? I think the only change, frankly speaking, maybe I'm wrong. I think the only change is that you need to have a CEO who is open to AI, who is AI friendly. I don't think it does not need to be AI native, like they like to say these days, but somebody who is not afraid of AI, who is open to learn about AI, who is open to apply AI, but who is still independent from AI. Because I think one of the great risks that we face, maybe not people of our generation, but people who are a little bit younger, is becoming too dependent on AI and losing our independent judgment. And of course, CEO really needs an independent judgment. So I would say the importance of independent judgment at the age of AI becomes even more pronounced.
Yeah. Sanne, Gilbert, very short comments on this.
I think in the AI, actually, I use it to challenge the headhunters, specifically on the industries. Because, if you can write what industry it is, and you start to say what industries are facing similar problems of the strategic alternatives, and then that helps me to Stanislav, absolutely fundamental point of getting better questions. And, if you ask these challenges questions of the headhunters you're helping and saying, why is this industry idle? Isn't it? It kind of, because they just go on autopilot, and they try to reach the, they make more money the quicker they get to a result. So I think that's one of the places in there. But I think that you have to have a persons who have a opinion about the AI in the future. If you don't have an opinion, then I think that you are more of a dinosaur of a CEO, and that will for definitely not be in the future. I'm fully with Stanislav that the native AI is not what I'm looking for, but it's somebody who's trying to understand how to get best use and best ROI of the AI in the company.
Yeah. Gilbert, before we jump on AI, if you allow me, as we have one question left time-wise, I would like to switch to another topic, which is also really important, which is this, and Stanislav mentioned it also, this onboarding of the CEO, and especially if you have some other candidates who didn't make the cut, and it's a very, we are in very volatile times. Based on your experience, what can the board best to help onboard a CEO and keep the talent in the company?
Yeah. No, look, I think it's a great question, and I had this in my career. When I was brought into Firmenich as the first non-family CEO in the history of this company, there were 3 runner-up, and at the same time, I was new to the industry. So the first thing is the board needs to explain to the current incumbents, to the runner-ups, why they didn't get the job and what type of capability they lacked, and why did the board choose this external candidate based on where they see the company going, and at the same time the capability that this leader brings. So this open conversation, this transparency between the board and the candidates is important. When I was brought in, maybe this explanation was not good enough. So I had to do it myself with the 3 runner-ups. And at the same time, I detached myself from the process, said, look, I didn't make the decision. The board made the decision. I would love to work with you guys. You bring an amazing experience that I lack. And, I want us to continue this journey together. Actually, it worked with 2 people that stayed with me, throughout my journey as a CEO. And one of them, said, look, no, I don't feel valued, and ended up moving on. And part of the onboarding, I think what is important for a new CEO is this, what I call them the 3 Ls: listen, learn, and lead. because when a new CEO is appointed, especially if you're not coming from the industry and you're doing your onboarding and you're going through the roadshow, doing the handovers, etc., etc., you need to listen, learn the industry, listen, because people will share with you their insight, learn, because you will learn from the people, the industry, what needs to be done differently. You have the opportunity to ask all the questions you want, and at the same time, make the right decisions. So these will be, my views based from my experience in this space.
Thank you, Gilbert. I think that's, I really like the 3L framing. It's also easy to keep in your mind. So unfortunately, the hour flew by, and we're at the end. We still have a lot of good questions. So what we did, we knew that we would have more questions than we could answer. So Gilbert, Sanna, and Stanislav kindly agreed. What we will do an interview with them, summarizing all your questions. And so you will get, we will send out a recording of the webinar, but then later on, you will also get the answers to your questions in the form of a written interview. And so hopefully for those whose questions did not get answered, we don't forget you. So thank you all so much for great questions and great input and additional food for thought. And especially very, very big thanks to Sanna, to Gilbert, and to Stanislav for sharing this all with us. Maybe just before we close off, one last small request, if you can put it, yeah. So we are currently, as the Center of Corporate Governance, together with NASDAQ, doing a global survey on board effectiveness, where we look at actual practices in the board. What do they actually do in CEO succession? How do they spend their times and other things? And we need at least 1,000 answers to be statistically significant. So we will send a link to this survey with the webinar recording, and would be extremely, for the moment, it's aimed at listed boards, would be extremely grateful if you could fill in the survey. But with that, I think the most important thing is thank you all for being there. Stanislav, please, the book is great. It gives an answer to many, many of your questions. So I can only recommend you read it. And Stanislav, Gilbert, and Sanna, thank you once again for sharing your wisdom. Thank you so much.